You know, there are moments in history when an entire industry falls. Not because the product is bad, not because the people aren't working hard enough, but because politics, trade wars, and backroom deals rewrite the rules overnight. Imagine this. For decades, the docks of Maine were alive with the sound of traps unloading, crates being filled, and lobsters heading out across the world. From Europe's finest restaurants to booming markets in China, Maine lobster was a global brand, a luxury seafood that symbolized quality, tradition, and pride. Generations had built their lives on it. Fathers taught sons how to set traps. Mothers managed the family businesses, and whole towns lived off the rhythm of the sea. But then, in what felt like a blink, it all collapsed. Tens of thousands of pounds of lobster that once shipped weekly to China suddenly dropped to almost zero. Rotting lobsters sat stacked on Maine's docks, unwanted, unsold, left behind, while across the border Canadian boats were sailing away, filling the same orders America had once owned. For fishermen who had built their identity on lobster, it felt like betrayal, humiliation, and the slow death of a way of life. So, how did the U.S. lobster industry crumble so fast? The answer wasn't in the ocean. The lobsters didn't vanish. The seas didn't dry up. No, the real battle was fought in politics, tariffs, and international trade diplomacy. For years, the U.S. and Canada had worked almost like brothers in the lobster world. They pulled from the same Atlantic waters, shared many of the same markets, and respected the same seasonal cycles. But when the trade war between Washington and Beijing exploded, lobster became a weapon. It wasn't steel, it wasn't oil, it was lobster, a clawed little creature suddenly worth billions in the geopolitical chessboard. China, one of the world's largest luxury seafood markets, had been buying huge volumes of American lobster. But when tariffs hit, Beijing pivoted almost instantly. And Canada? Canada wasted no time. In 2019 alone, Canadian lobster exports to China jumped by 40% in just 6 months. Think about that. While Maine's lobsters sat in storage crates, unsold, Canadian lobsters were being served on golden plates at wedding banquets in Shanghai and Guangzhou. Almost overnight, the U.S. lobster industry was cut out of its fastest-growing market. But China wasn't the only battlefield. Europe became the turning point, the place where Canada pulled off a masterstroke. They signed the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, better known as CETA, with the European Union. And with that one deal, Canadian lobster entered Europe tariff-free. Zero tariffs, no extra costs, straight into the luxury seafood markets of Paris, Madrid, and Rome. Meanwhile, U.S. lobster, especially Maine lobster, was slapped with tariffs as high as 8%. Now, 8% might not sound like much, but in bulk shipments worth millions, it was devastating. European chefs, wholesalers, and distributors did the math. Why pay more for the same lobster? Canadian lobster was cheaper, fresher, and tariff-free. Contracts that had once belonged to Maine were locked up by Canada. French restaurants switched their menus without hesitation. German wholesalers who had split orders between Boston and Halifax cut Boston out entirely. Overnight, Maine didn't just lose Europe, it lost it permanently. Canada didn't just grab a slice of the pie, they took the entire table. Canadian boats were booked months in advance. European luxury markets were overflowing with their lobsters, and Maine fishermen were left watching helplessly as their industry collapsed. And here's the cruel irony. Maine lobstermen weren't beaten at sea. They weren't losing because Canadian lobsters were better or tougher or tastier. In fact, chefs around the world will tell you that Maine and Nova Scotia lobsters are practically identical. The difference wasn't in the traps, it was in the treaties. Canada simply had the right signatures on the right deals, and that flipped the entire seafood world upside down. For Maine, this wasn't just about money. Lobstering in Maine is culture, it's identity, it's family. It's not like running a coffee shop where you can just lock the doors and walk away. These families had survived on lobster for generations, and suddenly history meant nothing. Trade agreements had gutted their market, and all the pride in the world couldn't pay the bills. Local economies spiraled. Tourists who used to come for fresh seafood shacks saw empty docks and struggling towns. Maine lobstermen, who once felt like kings of the sea, now felt like pawns in a game they couldn't control. Meanwhile, Canada was just getting started. After conquering Europe, they doubled down in Asia. Joining the massive Pacific trade deal, Canada gained privileged access to Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, and beyond. And in Asia, lobster isn't just food, it's status. It's a symbol of wealth, a luxury gift at weddings, a dish served at grand celebrations. In cities like Tokyo, Beijing, and Ho Chi Minh, lobster means power and prestige. And Canada knew exactly how to seize it. While U.S. lobsters kept crashing into tariffs, Canadian lobsters glided into Asia tariff-free, like they had a VIP pass. By 2023, Canada controlled 76% of China's live lobster market. The U.S.? Just 25%. Think about that for a moment. The United States, once the king of lobster, reduced to a quarter of the biggest seafood buying market on the planet. The numbers were brutal. By 2021, Canada's lobster exports hit $3.26 billion. That was 37% of their entire seafood export industry. Lobster wasn't just another product, it had become Canada's crown jewel. Across the border, U.S. exports limped in at just $459 million, less than $500 million. For Maine lobstermen, those numbers weren't just statistics. They were the sound of their heritage slipping away. And the worst part? It wasn't about taste. No one said Maine lobsters were inferior. Both Maine and Canadian lobsters were world-class. But in the new global seafood war, taste didn't matter. Trade agreements did. Washington tried to fight back, of course. Politicians smelled opportunity, and none faster than Donald Trump. He made Maine his stage, promising to save the lobster industry with tough talk and big gestures. But the truth? Europe didn't roll out the red carpet. Tariffs didn't vanish. Canadian contracts didn't crumble. What Trump delivered wasn't a revival. It was symbolism. And symbolism doesn't sell lobsters. When that failed, the U.S. tried a different tactic. Whales. Washington began accusing Canadian fisheries of threatening the endangered North Atlantic right whale, a species with barely 350 left alive. On the surface, it sounded noble. Save the whales, protect the ocean. But critics saw it as what it really was. A disguised trade barrier. A way to hit Canada without calling it a tariff. Canada hit back harder. They branded their lobster as eco-friendly, whale-safe, and sustainable. Suddenly, they weren't just selling seafood, they were selling ethics. Canadian lobster became the clean, green, environmentally responsible choice. Meanwhile, Maine lobstermen were left with subsidies and political promises. Senator Susan Collins fought hard, securing an $80 million subsidy package to keep lobstermen afloat. But everyone knew it was just a bandage on a wound that wasn't healing. The proud, self-sufficient U.S. lobster industry had become dependent on government support, while Canada sailed away with global markets and record profits. And that's how a once mighty American export collapsed. Not because the lobsters weren't there, not because the fishermen weren't skilled, but because politics turned lobsters into weapons, and Canada played the game better. The fall of the U.S. lobster industry is more than just an economic story. It's a cultural tragedy. It's about families watching their heritage vanish, about pride reduced to subsidies, about how trade agreements can reshape entire industries in the blink of an eye. In the end, Canada didn't just win the lobster wars. They rewrote the rules of the seafood world. And Maine, once the master of the seas, was left asking the hardest question of all. When the traps are empty and the markets are gone, what happens to a culture built on lobster?